History often celebrates the king on the throne, but what if the real ruler was the queen standing beside him? This is the story of the hidden sovereigns, the queens who exercised absolute authority behind ceremonial thrones. By the end of this journey, you will understand the sophisticated political playbook these women used to command empires from the shadows. How did a queen's private advice become the law of the land? And what happened when the king was too weak to rule at all? Their legacies force us to ask, where does true power really reside? The scene is a familiar one in the grand halls of history. Courtiers bow deeply before a king seated upon his throne, the very image of sovereign power. Yet if you watch closely, you might notice a subtle shift in the room, a quiet turning of attention. The eyes of seasoned ministers, the whispered consultations of ambassadors, they often drift not to the man wearing the crown, but to the woman standing just to his side, or perhaps seated at a smaller, less ornate chair nearby. In that unspoken glance lies the entire secret of the shadow sovereign. This is our core concept. We are not talking about a queen regnant, a woman who ruled in her own name and right, like Elizabeth I of England or Hatshepsut of Egypt. Their power was official, stamped on every decree. The shadow sovereign operated differently. She was most often a queen consort, the king's wife, or a queen regent, ruling temporarily for a child king. Her husband or son held the title, performed the ceremonies, and sat on the throne as the symbol of the state. But she, through a formidable combination of intelligence, patronage, and political cunning, held the substance of power. Her authority was de facto, meaning in practice rather than de jure by law. It existed in a fascinating legal gray area, a space she had to carve out and defend every single day. How did she do it? The mechanisms were often subtle, woven into the very fabric of court life. It began with counsel. A king might be weary from battle or disinterested in the minutiae of administration. His queen, trusted and often better educated in statecraft than he was, became his chief advisor. Her private words in the royal chambers became public policy by morning. Then there was the Treasury. Control over the royal purse strings meant control over everything, from funding armies to rewarding loyal nobles. A shadow sovereign who managed the kingdom's wealth held immense leverage. She could influence key appointments, placing her allies in positions of power throughout the government. And perhaps most crucially, she often managed foreign diplomacy, conducting private correspondence with other rulers and negotiating treaties from behind the scenes, her hand guiding the kingdom's relationships without ever officially signing her name. As historian Dr. Sarah Gristwood notes, this form of power was both pervasive and uniquely perilous. It was everywhere in monarchies across the globe, yet it was always conditional, always contested. A queen regnant's authority came from her birthright. A shadow sovereign's authority came from her relentless skill, her ability to read a room, to build unbreakable networks of support, and to never, ever appear to grasp for power too openly. She had to be the power behind the throne, never seen trying to sit upon it herself. This was her tightrope, one step too far, one moment of perceived overreach, and the carefully constructed illusion could shatter with devastating consequences. Her reign was a constant, delicate negotiation, a masterclass in the art of influence where the greatest success was to make the king's will look indistinguishable from her own. The most powerful cabinet meeting in the kingdom was not held in a council chamber, but in a bedchamber, far from the echoing halls of state. The true machinery of governance often whirred to life in the quiet, private apartments of the royal couple. This was the domain of the shadow sovereign, a space where the formalities of court melted away, and where a queen's most potent weapon was not a decree but a conversation. Her unparalleled access to the monarch's private life, his ear at the end of the day, became the single most reliable conduit for political influence. Historians sometimes call this the Bedchamber Cabinet, a term that captures how pillow talk and personal counsel could seamlessly translate into the law of the land. It was a subtle art. By controlling who gained an audience with the king, by managing his daily schedule and filtering the information that reached him, a queen essentially shaped his entire worldview. She was his first and last advisor, the one person who spoke to him not as a subject but as a partner. In these intimate moments, she could frame issues, suggest solutions, and gently steer his decisions long before any minister ever presented a formal petition. This personal sphere extended into the management of the vast royal household, which was itself a microcosm of the state, appointing the chamberlain, the stewards, the tutors for the royal children. These were not merely domestic choices. They were political appointments that placed her loyalists in positions of immense proximity to power. And through her influence over the royal children, she secured the dynasty's future, shaping the next generation of rulers to carry forward her vision and protect her legacy. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women of the Middle Ages. As Queen of England married to Henry II, her formal power was limited by the laws of the land. Yet her informal authority was immense. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, controlling vast and wealthy territories in what is now France. In the privacy of their court, her counsel on matters concerning Aquitaine was not just listened to, it was paramount. She was the indispensable expert, the key to managing those restless, culturally distinct lands. Her personal influence helped govern an empire, proving that the so-called domestic sphere was anything but. The heart of an empire, it seems, was often its hearth. This raises a compelling question. If a queen's power was so deeply personal, so tied to her relationship with the king, what happened when that relationship fractured, or when the king was simply not there at all? The currency of power in a royal court was not minted in gold but bestowed through favor. While the king might command the army, the queen, who controlled the treasury and the flow of royal patronage, commanded loyalty, and loyalty was the true engine of governance from the shadows. This was the Patronage Network, a web of obligation and reward woven with meticulous care. By distributing lands, titles, pensions, and prestigious appointments, a shadow sovereign could build a faction utterly devoted to her, a power base that operated in parallel to, and sometimes in defiance of, the traditional aristocracy. Her influence flowed through the very veins of the state. She could secure a bishopric for a loyal cleric, placing a sympathetic voice in the powerful church hierarchy. She financed artists and scholars not merely for culture's sake, but to craft a public image of wisdom, piety, and legitimacy that bolstered her standing. Most crucially, she could influence military appointments, ensuring key fortresses and regiments were commanded by men who owed their prominence to her grace, not the king's. As historian Dr. Tracy Adams explains, in the closed economies of medieval and early modern courts, patronage was a currency more valuable than gold. It purchased something money alone could not: unwavering personal allegiance. This network extended far beyond simple gifts. A masterful queen orchestrated strategic marriage alliances for her followers, binding powerful families to her cause through kinship. She placed trusted individuals in household positions across the nobility, creating a distributed network of eyes and ears, informal advisors and discreet informants who kept her apprised of every plot and grumble in the realm. Consider Anne of Brittany, who twice became Queen of France. Her true power stemmed from her independent status as the reigning Duchess of Brittany, a wealthy and strategically vital territory. She used her personal wealth and the offices she controlled as Duchess to reward French nobles who supported her interests, effectively creating a Breton faction within the French court that answered to her. Her well-managed patronage system gave her a leverage that rivaled the king's own, allowing her to influence foreign policy and protect Breton autonomy from within the French monarchy itself. Building such an intricate web required more than mere generosity. It demanded the acute political intelligence of a chess master, seeing the entire board and planning moves years in advance. But patronage, for all its strength, had a fundamental weakness. It was entirely dependent on the Queen's continued ability to grant favors. What happened when the source of those favors suddenly vanished? A sealed letter, its wax bearing a private cipher known only to two women, could alter the fate of nations. While kings addressed each other with formal proclamations, queens often conducted the real business of statecraft through confidential correspondence, building alliances with ink and insight. This was the realm of the diplomatic mastermind, where a queen consort transformed her unique position into a channel of immense soft power. She was both an insider to her husband's court and a cherished link to her native land, a living bridge between kingdoms. This dual identity granted her a perspective no male ambassador could ever claim, allowing her to advocate for policies that served dual interests or, more importantly, prevented open conflict. Historical archives are filled with the evidence of their quiet labor. Ambassadorial reports frequently noted that to understand a king's intentions, one must first understand his queen's counsel. Their personal letters to foreign rulers, siblings, or parents reveal intricate negotiations over trade, borders, and peace, discussions that officially never happened. One of their most potent tools was the social sphere. By hosting foreign dignitaries, organizing lavish festivals, and fostering personal rapport, a queen could create an atmosphere of goodwill that made formal treaty signing almost a formality. She turned diplomacy from a transaction between states into a bond between individuals. Furthermore, she was the chief architect of the ultimate royal alliance, the strategic marriage. By arranging unions between her children and the scions of other powerful houses, she wove a web of kinship that could secure peace for a generation. No figure exemplifies this geopolitical acumen more clearly than Catherine de' Medici. As Queen of France and later as the power behind the throne for her three sons, she navigated a kingdom tearing itself apart during the wars of religion. Her authority was that of a regent, but her strategy was that of a master diplomat. Catherine operated in a perpetual state of crisis management, negotiating tirelessly between warring Catholic and Protestant factions within France, while simultaneously engaging with foreign powers like Spain and England to prevent them from exploiting the internal chaos. She hosted summits, brokered fragile truces, and used marriage alliances in a desperate attempt to balance the scales and preserve the Valois dynasty. Her famous flying squadron of ladies-in-waiting were not just companions, they were her intelligence network and discreet messengers, gathering information and softening opposition in drawing rooms across the continent. Catherine understood that the survival of her family and her nation depended not on the battlefield but on the negotiating table, and she claimed that table as her own. This international web of correspondence and alliance was a high-stakes game, and it showcased a form of intelligence often overlooked in the annals of war, the sharp, patient, and profoundly connected mind of the shadow sovereign. Yet for all its sophistication, this behind-the-scenes authority rested on a foundation that could vanish in an instant. The king's seal felt heavy in her hand, a cold weight of absolute responsibility. When a monarch rode off to crusade, marched to a distant war, or simply passed from this world leaving a child as heir, the entire apparatus of the state did not pause. It transferred formally and completely into the hands of a regent. This was the moment the shadow sovereign stepped fully into the light. Her authority no longer whispered in corridors but proclaimed in every public square. Regency was the legal framework that transformed a queen's influence into outright command, granting her the right to preside over royal councils, issue decrees, raise armies, and administer justice in the king's name. It was power with a time limit, and that very limitation defined every one of her days. We must distinguish between two primary forms of this authority. The most common was regency for a child king, a period that could stretch for a decade or more, during which a queen mother ruled as protector of both her son and the kingdom. The other form occurred during a monarch's prolonged absence or incapacitation, where a queen consort acted as lieutenant of the realm. In both cases, the regent wielded near absolute power, but it was always understood to be held in trust. As historian Helen Castor notes, this legal sanction could legitimize female rule in a way informal influence never could, yet it also painted a target on the regent's back. Her every decision was scrutinized, her every motive questioned by nobles who saw a temporary power vacuum as their personal opportunity. The challenges were immense. Maintaining the support of the nobility required a constant, delicate balance of firmness and favor. A regent had to demonstrate the strength to crush rebellion, yet the wisdom to avoid creating new enemies. She had to manage the treasury to fund governance without imposing burdens that sparked unrest. And always looming on the horizon was the inevitable and often fraught transition of power back to the king. Would the young monarch come of age resent her stewardship? Would the returning warrior king feel his authority had been diminished in his absence? A successful regent had to rule effectively enough to preserve the kingdom, yet humbly enough to ensure she could gracefully and safely relinquish the throne. No one mastered this precarious balance better than Blanche of Castile. When her husband, King Louis VIII of France, passed away in 1226, their son, the future Saint Louis IX, was just 12 years old. For over a decade, Blanche ruled France as regent. She faced immediate and violent rebellion from powerful French barons who saw a woman and a boy as weak links. Blanche responded not with hesitation but with decisive military action, personally overseeing campaigns that crushed the uprisings. She negotiated a crucial peace treaty with England, securing favorable terms that strengthened the French crown. She administered justice, patronized learning, and managed the realm's finances with shrewd acumen. In doing so, she not only protected her son's inheritance but solidified the power of the Capetian monarchy, paving the way for his future reign as one of France's most revered kings. Blanche's regency was not a caretaker government. It was a period of aggressive state-building, proving that the so-called temporary ruler could leave a permanent legacy. Regency was the ultimate crucible for these hidden rulers. It took the skills they had honed in the shadows, counsel, patronage, diplomacy, and tested them under the blinding sun of supreme responsibility. It asked them to be both a mother and a monarch, a protector and a sovereign. And when the king finally came of age or returned home, the seal was passed back, the regent stepped aside, and the visible machinery of power shifted once more. But the realm they handed over was indelibly marked by their will, a kingdom shaped not just by the king who left, but by the queen who stayed and held everything together. The keys to the royal treasury were not just metal, they were the very skeleton keys to power itself. While a king might command loyalty through law, a queen who controlled the kingdom's wealth commanded it through necessity, for she held the lifeblood of the state in her hands. Economic control was the most concrete, undeniable pillar of a shadow sovereign's authority. This went far beyond personal extravagance. Many queens arrived at court with vast personal wealth, immense dowries, and income from their own inherited lands, giving them a financial independence that translated directly into political leverage. But the truly formidable ones extended their reach into the management of state revenues, the royal treasury itself. They decided which military campaigns received funding, which noble families were granted lucrative pensions, and which public works projects broke ground. A glance at medieval treasury rolls and account ledgers reveals their direct signatures and orders, proving their hands were not just on the scepter, but on the purse strings. This financial power was deployed with surgical precision. Rewarding loyal allies was the most immediate use. A well-timed grant of land or an annual stipend could turn a wavering baron into a steadfast supporter overnight. Conversely, the subtle delay of a payment or the reassignment of a profitable trade monopoly could ruin a political opponent without a single public accusation being made. Furthermore, a queen could initiate grand building projects, cathedrals, universities, or hospitals that served a dual purpose. They addressed public needs, building immense goodwill among the common people, while also etching her name and legacy permanently into the stone of the realm. She became a patron, a benefactor, a visible source of stability and prosperity. Many also established charitable foundations which, while genuinely pious, functioned as sophisticated networks of influence, providing arms and support that created a broad base of public affection and loyalty directly tied to her person. A powerful case study of this financial mastery is Isabella of France, often called the She-Wolf. Following the deposition of her husband, King Edward II of England, Isabella ruled alongside her ally Roger Mortimer during the minority of her son, Edward III. Their first and most crucial act was to seize control of the royal treasury. With the kingdom's wealth at their command, they methodically used it to consolidate their fragile regime. They paid the salaries of key garrison commanders to ensure military loyalty. They distributed lands and titles to reward those who had supported the coup. They funded the day-to-day operations of government, ensuring continuity and stability that legitimized their rule. The treasury was their primary tool for transforming a violent political upheaval into a functioning administration. For a few critical years, Isabella proved that controlling the flow of money was synonymous with controlling the pulse of the nation itself. It was a cold, calculative form of power, one that required the mind of a banker and the nerve of a gambler. Yet this very strength, this absolute control over resources, could also become a queen's greatest vulnerability. What happened when the coffers ran dry, or when her financial maneuvers created enemies more powerful than the friends they bought? A queen's most enduring monument was not a castle, but a cathedral. While kings built fortresses to project military might, the shadow sovereigns of history built in stone and spirit, using culture and faith as the subtle, unassailable bedrock of their authority. To shape a kingdom's ideology was to shape its very soul, and no one understood this better than a queen patron. From the quiet scriptorium where a beautifully illuminated manuscript was crafted to the soaring vault of a new basilica, their influence permeated the cultural and religious landscape, reinforcing their legitimacy and etching their legacy into the permanent record of civilization. As patrons of the church, they wielded a soft power that could rival any army. Funding the construction of monasteries, convents, and cathedrals did more than demonstrate personal piety. It created centers of learning and influence directly tied to their name. These institutions required abbots and bishops to run them, and the Queen's recommendation often decided who filled these powerful ecclesiastical positions. By placing allies within the church hierarchy, she gained a moral authority that was nearly impossible to challenge publicly. She could promote specific religious reforms or charitable orders that aligned with her vision for the realm, framing her political goals as acts of divine virtue. This spiritual stewardship extended to the promotion of saints, particularly those associated with her own family lineage, weaving her bloodline into the sacred fabric of the nation itself. In the cultural sphere, their patronage was equally strategic. Queens sponsored poets who composed epic verses celebrating the dynasty's glorious history, with a special emphasis on the wise and virtuous Queen Mother. They commissioned tapestries and portraits where their image was placed deliberately beside the king's, or even in poses of counsel and instruction. Art historians point to subtle iconography, a book in her hand symbolizing wisdom, a gesture toward the king indicating guidance, or the inclusion of her personal emblem alongside royal coats of arms. These were not mere decorations, they were visual propaganda, broadcasting a message of partnership and indispensable wisdom to every noble who entered the court. Even the seemingly private act of religious pilgrimage served a public purpose. A queen's journey to a distant shrine was a grand procession, a mobile court that allowed her to network with regional nobles, display her devotion to the people, and solidify her image as the realm's foremost protector of the faith. No figure embodies this fusion of piety, politics, and patronage more completely than Theodora, the wife of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. Born into humble circumstances, Theodora rose to become perhaps the most powerful woman in Byzantine history, a true partner in rule. Her influence on religious policy was profound and personal. While Justinian championed Orthodox Chalcedonian Christianity, Theodora was a fervent advocate for the Monophysite Christians, a sect persecuted by the official church. She used her position to provide sanctuary for Monophysite leaders within the palace itself, sponsored their monasteries, and tirelessly lobbied her husband for more tolerant policies. In doing so, she maintained a critical balance of power, acting as a protector for a significant portion of the empire's population and ensuring their loyalty to the throne. Her cultural impact was set literally in stone. Following the devastating Nika riots that nearly toppled Justinian's reign, it was Theodora's famous resolve that steeled him to stay and fight. The subsequent rebuilding of Constantinople was their shared vision, culminating in the monumental Hagia Sophia. While Justinian provided the means, Theodora's influence permeated the project. She commissioned other magnificent churches like the Church of Saints Sergius and Bacchus, often called Little Hagia Sophia, which prominently featured mosaics honoring her. Through these acts, she didn't just decorate the city, she helped redefine its spiritual and imperial identity, presenting the reign of Justinian and Theodora as a new golden age ordained by God. Theodora proved that a queen could build theological arguments and architectural wonders with the same decisive hand a king might wield a sword. In the quiet of a chapel or the grandeur of a fresco, she could argue for her own necessity, making her presence within the power structure seem as natural and everlasting as the faith itself. This cultural and religious authority offered a profound kind of protection, but it was not absolute. For the shadow sovereign, every source of power also contained a potential flaw, a vulnerability that could unravel years of careful work in a moment of crisis. A single whispered word, delivered at the right moment, could be more valuable than a chest of gold. In the shadowed corridors of power, where official proclamations were often just the final act in a long, secret drama, the queen who mastered the flow of information held the ultimate advantage. She became the kingdom's central intelligence agency, her private chambers the clearinghouse for every rumor, grievance, and conspiracy. In an age without instant communication, where news traveled at the speed of a horse or a human messenger, controlling that information was not just an asset, it was the very essence of survival and command. This was the domain of the intelligence gatherer, a role that required a brilliant, calculating mind and a network of absolute loyalty. Queens cultivated intricate spy networks that operated independently of the king's official messengers. Their sources were everywhere, a testament to their deep understanding of human nature and social hierarchy. Trusted ladies-in-waiting, whose presence in every noble household was considered natural, became discreet observers, reporting back on private conversations and shifting alliances. Chamberlains and stewards who managed the estates of rival lords provided economic intelligence, noting who was spending beyond their means or stockpiling resources for potential rebellion. Even couriers and scribes could be persuaded or bribed to reveal the contents of diplomatic packets before they reached their intended recipient. The methods were as sophisticated as they were covert. Ciphers and coded letters, where seemingly innocent phrases carried hidden meanings, ensured private correspondence remained private. double agents planted within rival factions could feed false information back to their masters, creating confusion and mistrust. Surveillance was constant, the simple act of a noble receiving a foreign ambassador noted, timed, and analyzed for its potential meaning. As research into early modern statecraft confirms, in these tightly wound courts, information was the ultimate currency, more liquid and powerful than gold. It allowed a queen to preempt threats, to reward loyalty before it was even publicly declared, and to punish disloyalty with devastating precision, often without her hand ever being seen. She could shape the narrative presented to the king, ensuring he saw the political landscape through a lens she had carefully polished. Consider again the formidable Catherine de' Medici, navigating the lethal factions of the French wars of religion. Her survival and her influence depended entirely on her legendary espionage system. She maintained what historians often call her flying squadron, a group of beautiful and intelligent young women from loyal noble families, placed strategically in the households of powerful, often hostile lords. These women were not just decorative, they were her primary intelligence operatives, gathering secrets through pillow talk and casual conversation. Catherine also had a network of spies within the printing houses, monitoring seditious pamphlets and informants in city taverns to gauge the public mood. This constant stream of raw data allowed her to stay one precarious step ahead of plots against the crown, to broker deals from a position of foreknowledge, and to manipulate events by selectively revealing or concealing what she knew. By holding the secrets others wished to hide, she held their futures in her hands. This invisible web of knowledge transformed her from a political player into the master of the board, the one person who could see all the pieces moving in the dark. Yet this power, drawn from shadows and whispers, carried a profound and inherent risk. To know everything was to make enemies of everyone who had a secret to lose, and in a world where knowledge was power, the keeper of the secrets could become the most tempting target of all. The council chamber was a fortress of male ambition, its air thick with the scent of old parchment and quiet rivalry. For a queen to enter this space was to navigate a minefield of unspoken rules, where a direct command could shatter her influence, but a well-placed suggestion could steer an empire. In the rigidly patriarchal structures of royal courts, exercising power required a masterful performance of femininity, a political jiu-jitsu that turned societal expectations into tools of command. Gender historians note that these women became adept at using the very language meant to confine them. They framed their interventions not as power grabs, but as extensions of their natural roles as mother and wife. A plea for clemency became a mother's mercy. A strategic marriage alliance was presented as a wifely duty to secure the dynasty's future. By couching statecraft in the familiar terms of domestic care, they made their authority palatable, even necessary, to the men who officially held power. Another crucial technique was the pose of humility. A queen might publicly defer to her husband or his council, all while working behind the scenes to orchestrate the outcome she desired. She could skillfully play rival court factions against one another, appearing above the fray while secretly ensuring her preferred faction gained the upper hand. This required an exquisite understanding of every noble's ambition and insecurity, turning their conflicts into levers for her own control. Building alliances was not optional, it was essential for survival. Aligning with powerful male relatives, a brother or an uncle, could provide a shield of familial loyalty. Forming bonds with influential clergy granted her the armor of religious sanction, allowing her to argue that her policies were not just politically sound but morally righteous. Cultivating a reputation for profound piety was a strategic shield, making criticism of her actions seem like criticism of virtue itself. Few faced this challenge more starkly than Margaret of Anjou, the French-born queen of the mentally fragile King Henry VI of England. From the moment she arrived, the English court viewed her with deep suspicion, her foreign origins a constant mark against her. When Henry's periods of incapacity grew longer and the kingdom teetered toward the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, Margaret could not afford to remain a passive consort. With no formal regency declared, she stepped into the void. She became the unwavering leader of the Lancastrian cause, raising armies, negotiating for funds, and directing military strategy to defend her husband's throne and her son's inheritance. She governed in Henry's name, issuing orders and rallying supporters. Yet for every action she took, she faced torrents of vicious, misogynistic propaganda from her Yorkist rivals, who painted her as an unnatural, scheming woman, a she-wolf violating the natural order. Margaret's career is a perfect, painful illustration of the tightrope. To save the kingdom for her family, she had to act with a king's decisiveness, but in doing so, she provided her enemies with the very ammunition they needed to vilify her. Her success was a testament to sheer political will, and her downfall a reminder of the brutal limits imposed on a woman's authority when she stepped too visibly into a man's world. It was a perilous dance where the performance of feminine duty masked the exercise of sovereign strength, and where the greatest skill was making the realm's survival look like a wifely obligation fulfilled. Her intelligence network was a shield, but a queen's true strength lay in the army she could call by name. In the shifting sands of court politics, influence was fragile unless it was organized, given structure and a common purpose. The most formidable shadow sovereigns did not merely have admirers, they commanded a faction, a coherent political party whose loyalty was to her vision first and the crown second. This was power crystallized, moving beyond private counsel into the realm of collective action. Building such a block was a deliberate, multi-year project. It began, as always, with the currency of patronage, but now directed with surgical precision. Lands and titles were granted not at random, but to create a geographically and economically interconnected group, their fortunes rising together. Strategic marriage alliances bound powerful families to the Queen's cause, weaving a web of kinship where loyalty to the faction was loyalty to one's own relatives. She also tapped into shared ideologies, whether religious reform, a particular foreign policy stance, or regional interests, giving her followers a cause that transcended simple personal gain. As political historians note, these royal court factions were the direct ancestors of modern political parties, complete with shared platforms, disciplined voting blocks in councils, and recognized leadership. Managing this human machinery required a deft touch. The Queen had to balance competing ambitions within her own group, rewarding stalwarts while integrating new, powerful converts. She had to enforce discipline, ensuring her followers presented a united front, and did not make independent deals that could undermine her broader strategy. The risk, of course, was that factional politics, once unleashed, could spiral out of control. What began as a tool for managing the king's government could harden into bitter, entrenched opposition, turning policy debates into personal vendettas and potentially igniting the spark of civil war. The court became a chessboard, and every piece answered to her. A potent, though tragically brief, example of this engine in motion is Anne Boleyn's ascent in the court of Henry VIII. Her influence was not a solo performance. She consciously built and led a formidable faction, a party with clear objectives. Its members included her brother George Boleyn, the rising bureaucratic genius Thomas Cromwell, and a network of reform-minded clergy and nobles who saw in Anne a champion for religious change and a break from the old guard. This was not a casual collection of supporters, it was an organized political machine. They worked in concert to promote evangelical ideas, to discredit Cardinal Wolsey and other opponents, and to tirelessly advocate for the annulment of Henry's first marriage. Anne's faction provided the king with both the ideological justification and the practical political pressure needed to enact the English Reformation, a revolution that would permanently reshape the nation's church, state, and identity. Her leadership demonstrates the raw power of collective action orchestrated from the Queen's apartments. She showed that a faction could alter the very axis of history. Yet this same brilliant strategy also sealed her fate, for in creating a party of her own, she created an equally determined party of enemies, all watching, waiting for a single misstep. The faction was both her sword and the ground upon which her final stand would be made. The king's vacant gaze, fixed on some distant point beyond the council chamber windows, spoke a silent truth that echoed louder than any proclamation. A monarch's physical presence on the throne did not guarantee a functioning mind or a willing spirit within it. This presented the most delicate and dangerous scenario for a shadow sovereign, a realm where the king was a living symbol, yet incapable of symbolizing anything but vulnerability. Queens in this position did not rule merely behind the throne, they ruled in its stead, while the man who was supposed to occupy it remained seated as a hollow, complicating figurehead. Unlike a formal regency where authority was legally transferred during a king's minority or absence, this was governance through necessity, a daily exercise of power conducted in the shadow of a sovereign who was present but powerless. Psychological historians note that conditions we might now understand as profound melancholy, debilitating illness, or cognitive decline were often recorded in chronicles as a king's strange humors or a divine affliction. For the queen, this meant her assumption of duties was often a gradual, creeping process, responding to each new crisis the king could not, until one day she simply was the government. The dynamics were uniquely treacherous. The king's continued existence meant rival claimants to the throne, often ambitious uncles or cousins, could not openly move against the crown itself, but they could and did challenge the queen's right to act in his name. Every decree she issued, every appointment she made, could be framed as a usurpation of the royal will, even if that will had long ceased to be coherent. Her greatest challenge was managing public perception, to make her necessary rule appear as the natural extension of wifely duty, a loyal spouse merely interpreting and enacting her husband's unspoken wishes for the good of the realm. She had to perform a constant, exhausting pantomime of consultation, publicly seeking his blessing on decisions he may not have even understood, all to maintain the fragile illusion of a united royal front. The story of Maria of Montferrat, Queen of Jerusalem in the early 13th century, is a stark lesson in this subtle art. She was the hereditary queen of the embattled Crusader state, and to bolster its defenses, she married the experienced French knight John of Brienne, who then became king by right of his wife. Contemporary chroniclers, however, paint a revealing picture. While John held the title and led military efforts, the complex, day-to-day administration of the kingdom, the diplomacy with other Christian powers, and wary negotiation with neighboring Muslim rulers fell squarely to Maria. Historical accounts suggest she was the steady, calculating mind governing the realm's internal stability, making her the essential anchor during a period of extreme external threat. Her authority was the quiet, constant force that kept the kingdom functioning while her husband fought to keep it alive. In such situations, the queen's role transformed from influential advisor to indispensable administrator. She became the realm's memory, its consistency, the hand that kept the ship of state on course while the designated captain was incapacitated. This was power born not of ambition, but of sheer emergency, a burden shouldered because the alternative was collapse. Yet this very necessity, this demonstration of her capability, could become the greatest threat to her position, proving to all observers that the kingdom did not just function without the king, it might even function better. The future of a dynasty was not written in law but in the mind of a child. While a queen might command the present through counsel and patronage, her most enduring legacy was often sculpted in the schoolroom through the careful, daily education of the heir to the throne. As the primary overseer of royal upbringing, a shadow sovereign held a power that transcended her own lifespan. the power to shape the very consciousness of the next king or queen, ensuring her political vision and chosen loyalties would guide the realm long after she was gone. This was the ultimate long game, a quiet investment in the future with returns measured in decades of stable policy. The curriculum she designed or approved went far beyond basic literacy. It was a blueprint for governance. History lessons were carefully curated to highlight the virtues of certain ancestors and the follies of others, subtly teaching which policies led to glory and which to ruin. Language training was strategic, focusing on the tongues of allied nations or vital trading partners. Most importantly, the heir was immersed in the Queen's own political philosophy, learning to value the advisors she trusted, to prioritize the alliances she had built, and to see the kingdom through the interpretive lens she provided. Studies on royal childhood, such as those by historian Dr. Janice Gibbs, emphasize that these formative years were less about childish play and more about an intensive apprenticeship in power, with the Queen Mother as the chief architect of the heir's worldview. Her control extended to the selection of every tutor, nurse, and companion, ensuring the young prince or princess was surrounded only by individuals whose loyalty to her was absolute. These appointed guardians reinforced her lessons at every turn, turning the schoolroom into an echo chamber for her political agenda. Furthermore, a clever queen could use the heir as a potent political symbol during her own time of influence. Presenting a well-educated, pious, and composed young successor to the court and to foreign ambassadors was a powerful demonstration of the dynasty's strength and continuity, a living argument for the stability of her current rule. It signaled that the future was secure and secure on her terms. A profound example of this educational power is Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII. Her significance stretches far beyond surviving the turbulent king. When Henry went to war in France, he named Catherine regent, a testament to her trusted capability. But her deeper influence was exercised as stepmother to the royal children, particularly the young Elizabeth. Catherine was a noted intellectual, a patron of learning and religious reform. She took a direct hand in Elizabeth's education, surrounding her with brilliant humanist tutors and fostering an environment where rigorous scholarship and Protestant theology were encouraged. The princess, who had known instability and trauma, found in Catherine's household a model of erudite, resilient female authority. The formidable intellect, the political acumen, and the steely devotion to Protestantism that would define Queen Elizabeth I's legendary reign were undoubtedly nurtured in those formative years under Catherine's guidance. In molding Elizabeth's mind, Catherine Parr planted seeds that would blossom into one of the most iconic reigns in English history, a direct line of influence from one queen's schoolroom to another's throne. This was the shadow sovereign's most patient art, teaching the heir not merely to rule, but to rule in a way that honored her legacy, turning a child's education into the most permanent inscription of her power upon the kingdom. A single marriage contract could be more valuable than a victorious army. On a map of medieval Europe, you would see borders shifting through conquest, but on a sprawling family tree, you would see an empire built through matrimony, its branches carefully grafted by a queen's strategic hand. This was the architecture of dynasty, where queens acted as master planners, using kinship as both shield and sword to secure power for generations. While kings often focused on the immediate theater of war, queens orchestrated the long game of alliance, weaving a web of loyalties through the marriages of their children, relatives, and even themselves. Their work transformed family ties into geopolitical facts, making a cousin in a foreign court a potential ally and a daughter in a rival kingdom a living bridge to peace. Sociologists who study kinship and power note that in these pre-modern states, the personal was profoundly political. A royal marriage was never just a union of two individuals. It was a merger of resources, a non-aggression pact, and a statement of shared destiny, all negotiated in the precise language of dowries and treaties. The Queen, as the chief architect, operated on multiple levels. She leveraged her own natal family, the network she was born into, to bolster her position in her husband's court. A brother who was a powerful duke, an uncle who was a cardinal, these connections provided her with independent sources of information, support, and at times subtle pressure she could apply from beyond the border. She then extended this web outward through her children. Negotiating a marriage was a complex diplomatic undertaking. The dowry was not merely a gift, it was a transfer of wealth and often territory, a calculated investment. The accompanying treaty could outline military support, trade rights, and succession plans, binding two realms together with clauses as strong as any chain. But the Queen's work did not end at the altar. She then had to manage the ongoing relationships between in-laws, smoothing over disputes, fostering correspondence, and ensuring the alliance remained fruitful and loyal. Her court became a hub of constant communication, a diplomatic switchboard operated through family letters. Eleanor of Aquitaine provides a masterclass in this form of empire building. As Queen to Henry II of England, she presided over the vast Plantagenet domains. Her genius lay in seeing her many children not just as a family, but as a diplomatic corps. She strategically married her daughters to the Count of Toulouse, the King of Castile, and the King of Sicily. Each union was a deliberate placement, extending the Plantagenet influence deep into the heart of Europe, creating allies who could pressure rivals from the south or supply funds and knights from the east. Through these marriages, Eleanor did not conquer new lands with soldiers. She infiltrated foreign courts with her own blood, creating a kinship network that made the Plantagenet Empire a dominant family affair. This was power exercised not through the roar of battle, but through the quiet, relentless work of connection, turning the entire continent into a board game where every piece was a relative. Yet this brilliant strategy of weaving kingdoms together through marriage carried a hidden tension, for it created a network of obligations and rivalries as complex as the family tree itself. The sound of stones shattering against the outer wall was a queen's call to command. When a kingdom faced its darkest hour, with the king away at a distant war or incapacitated by illness, the theoretical power of the shadow sovereign transformed into something immediate and absolute. This was the crucible of the crisis manager, where a queen's role shifted from influential advisor to the central command authority of a realm fighting for its very survival. Military leadership was not a theoretical exercise in these moments. It was a brutal, logistical reality. A queen in this position had to make decisions that would be scrutinized by history, all while the smoke of siege fires darkened the sky. Her tasks were monumental. She had to raise and fund armies, often from her own resources or through desperate negotiations with wealthy merchants. She ordered the fortification of city walls, the stockpiling of food and armaments, and the mobilization of every able-bodied citizen for the defense. She appointed military commanders, balancing their experience with their loyalty, knowing a single betrayal could mean the fall of a city. As military historians note, the logistics of medieval warfare were a nightmare of supply chains and manpower, a challenge that demanded not just courage, but the meticulous mind of a chief executive. Beyond the battlefield, her weapon was rhetoric. In the absence of the king, her voice had to become the voice of the realm. She issued proclamations to bolster public morale, framing the defense as a sacred duty to protect home and faith. She used propaganda, circulating letters and funding sermons that portrayed the enemy as heretics or tyrants, and her own leadership as the only bulwark against chaos. Perhaps the most agonizing decisions came at the negotiating table. To save a city from sack or an army from annihilation, a crisis manager queen might have to make painful concessions in a treaty, surrendering territory or wealth to secure a peace that lived to fight another day. These were choices between catastrophic loss and humiliating survival, each carrying a legacy of blame. The defense of Paris in 1413 provides a stark window into this pressure. With King Charles VI suffering prolonged periods of mental illness and the KINGDOM Chinese letter by the conflict between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, Paris descended into anarchy during the Cabotian Revolt. Mobs seized the streets, prisons were stormed, and government authority evaporated. In this vacuum, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, a figure whose historical legacy is deeply complex and often criticized, nonetheless stepped into the role of crisis manager. From the relative safety of the fortified Louvre and later the Hotel St. Paul, she became the operational center of what remained of royal authority. She negotiated directly with the rebellious Cabotian leaders, not from a position of strength, but from one of desperate necessity, trying to restore some semblance of order and prevent the complete destruction of the capital. She issued orders, attempted to control the city gates, and worked to maintain a fragile line of communication with all factions. Her actions during this urban chaos were not those of a passive consort. They were the direct, executive interventions of a ruler trying to hold a crumbling state together by sheer force of will. In such moments, the elaborate pageantry of court life burned away, revealing the raw substance of authority. It asked a woman to be a general, a quartermaster, a diplomat, and a symbol of resilience all at once. These crises proved that the capability to rule was not gendered. It was forged in the emergency of a besieged castle or a rebellious capital, where the only question that mattered was who had the clarity and courage to act. For a queen who had spent a lifetime mastering the arts of influence, this was the ultimate test: to exchange the subtle tools of the shadow sovereign for the blunt instruments of command. The law was the kingdom's skeleton, and a queen's hand could subtly reshape its very bones. Beyond the battlefield and the council chamber lay the quiet, potent arena of the legal strategist, where influence was inscribed not in whispers but in parchment and precedent. A shadow sovereign understood that to shape the law was to shape the future itself, crafting a legacy that would endure long after her personal patronage networks had faded. Her tools were not swords or spies, but legal charters, succession decrees, and the measured language of judicial authority. Historical records reveal their indirect mark everywhere, in the marginal notes on draft legislation, in the petitions they endorsed, and in the very structure of legal codes compiled under their patronage. Their interventions often began with the most personal of stakes, the succession. A queen could work tirelessly behind the scenes to amend or clarify the laws of inheritance, ensuring the throne passed to her own child, perhaps over an older half-sibling from the king's previous marriage, or solidifying the rules to prevent the destructive civil wars that so often followed an ambiguous succession. This was not mere maternal favoritism, it was statecraft of the highest order, an attempt to guarantee a stable transition of power that would preserve the realm. They also advocated for laws that protected wider social policies aligned with their vision, whether concerning trade, the rights of religious minorities, or the administration of justice. By commissioning the compilation and standardization of legal texts, a queen could imprint a sense of order and royal authority across a fragmented kingdom, making the crown's law the common law. In the judicial sphere, they frequently intervened in specific cases, most often to grant pardons or show mercy. This public act of clemency served a dual purpose. It demonstrated the queen's compassionate nature, building popular goodwill, while simultaneously asserting her authority to override the courts, reminding everyone that final justice flowed through the royal household. The legendary struggle of Empress Matilda for the English throne in the 12th century, while she was a claimant in her own right, perfectly illustrates the brutal importance of mastering legal arguments. Her two-decade civil war against her cousin Stephen was not just a military conflict. It was a protracted legal debate fought with armies. Matilda's entire claim hinged on her father's decree and the complex laws of succession, forcing her to become a consummate legal strategist, arguing her case before the nobility and the church to legitimize her rule. Her fight underscores a fundamental truth for any woman near the throne: the language of law was a necessary second tongue. To influence it was to move beyond temporary power, etching one's priorities into the permanent architecture of the state, where a single amended clause could guide the destiny of a nation for 100 years. This legal legacy was perhaps their most enduring shadow, cast long across the centuries. Yet for all this calculated shaping of law and lineage, the starkest test of a queen's authority often arrived without warning, in the sudden, silent void left by a king's passing. The queen's public face was a masterpiece of political theater, a mask of majesty that made her private power possible. Imagine a royal procession winding through the crowded streets of London. The king rides at the head, a symbol of martial strength, but the eyes of the people are often drawn to the queen's carriage. She is adorned in cloth of gold and jewels, her posture serene, her hand raised in a gesture of blessing. This is not a passive display, it is an active performance of queenship, a calculated demonstration of legitimacy designed to win hearts and quiet dissent. For the shadow sovereign, managing the dichotomy between her symbolic role and her substantive power was not a contradiction, it was a necessary strategy. Her public image was a vital tool, softening the edges of her influence and making her behind-the-scenes authority not just acceptable, but welcomed by the populace. Scholars of royal ritual note that these ceremonies were far more than empty pageantry. They were the visual and emotional language of power, reinforcing political reality through shared spectacle. Every element was a message. Her dress communicated wealth and divine favor. Her participation in religious festivals, like distributing alms on Maundy Thursday, framed her as the realm's pious mother, directly connecting with the common people in a way the distant king often could not. Portraiture became a powerful medium for shaping perception. A painted queen might hold a book to signify wisdom, rest a hand on a globe to suggest geopolitical reach, or be depicted alongside her children to emphasize her role as the fertile mother of the nation's future. These images were disseminated among the nobility and foreign courts, crafting a narrative that supported her political position. A master of this symbolic craft was Elizabeth Woodville, the commoner queen of Edward IV of England. Her marriage was controversial, and her family's rapid advancement bred deep resentment among the old nobility, threatening the stability of the Yorkist reign. Elizabeth countered this not in council chambers alone, but in the public eye. She meticulously performed the role of the perfect queen. Her renowned beauty and grace became assets celebrated in ballads and chronicles. She presented herself as a fertile and devoted mother, bearing the king many children and thus securing the dynasty's lineage. Publicly, she engaged in acts of charity and religious patronage, presenting an image of benevolence and piety that helped legitimize her husband's sometimes precarious rule. During Edward's brief overthrow, when she famously sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her daughters, her very presence in that sacred space turned her into a living symbol of vulnerable royalty, garnering public sympathy. Elizabeth understood that the spectacle was not a distraction from governance, it was an integral component of it. By perfecting the performance of queenship, she built a reservoir of popular goodwill that helped protect her family's position, proving that in the theater of monarchy, the applause of the crowd could be as decisive as the loyalty of an army. This careful cultivation of image served as both shield and scepter, but it also created a cage of expectations where the woman behind the mask had to forever ensure the performance never slipped. The most sensitive state secrets were not debated in the throne room, but among the rose bushes in a queen's private garden. While the king's formal council met with all its pomp and protocol, A far more consequential meeting was often taking place in the Queen's solar, her private sitting room, or even her herb garden. This was the Shadow Council, an informal advisory body of her most trusted confidants, a parallel government that operated with a speed and secrecy the official bureaucracy could never match. Historians sometimes call this a kitchen cabinet, a term that captures its intimate, unofficial nature. Its members were chosen not for their noble titles, but for their unwavering loyalty and specific expertise. You would find her clever younger brother, whose ambition was tied entirely to her success, a learned cleric who provided not just spiritual guidance but intricate knowledge of canon law. Scholars from the university who understood finance or foreign languages, and skilled administrators who knew how to turn a bold idea into actionable policy. This small group became the engine of her influence. They were the ones who helped her draft the private letters that shaped foreign policy. They crunched the numbers on royal revenues to find funds for her projects. They formulated arguments and strategies she would then, seemingly independently, suggest to the king. As expert commentary on personal monarchy notes, this was a common and highly effective feature of rule, allowing a sovereign, or a shadow sovereign, to bypass the slow, contentious debates of the formal council and get things done. The tension this created was inevitable and often dangerous. The great nobles on the king's official council, the dukes and earls whose birthright was to advise the crown, deeply resented being circumvented by this closed circle of what they saw as upstarts and favorites. Their jealousy was not petty, it was a political reaction to being stripped of their traditional access and influence. Every grant of land to a member of her kitchen cabinet, every policy enacted without their consultation, was seen as an erosion of their power, a theft of their rightful role. This risked creating powerful, entrenched enemies who waited for a moment of royal weakness to strike back at her network. A masterful example of ruling through such a network is Margaret of Austria. Appointed governor of the Habsburg Netherlands by her father, Emperor Maximilian I, she was the de facto ruler of that wealthy, complex region for nearly 3 decades. Though she never held the title of queen in those lands, her authority was absolute. She governed not through force, but through a brilliantly assembled shadow council. She gathered around her a cotta of talented diplomats, legal minds, and cultural patrons, including the great humanist scholar Erasmus. This informal cabinet helped her transform the Netherlands into a peaceful, prosperous center of Renaissance art and international diplomacy, navigating the treacherous politics between France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Her will flowed through this parallel structure, allowing her to administer justice, negotiate treaties, and foster economic growth with an efficiency that bureaucratic channels would have stifled. Her court became a school for statecraft, and her advisors, loyal directly to her, executed a vision that made the region a beacon of stability and power. The Shadow Council was the ultimate instrument of personal rule, a direct conduit from a queen's mind to the machinery of state. It proved that true governance often happened not in the hall of public record, but in the quiet room where a few trusted voices could speak with absolute honesty. Her wealth was measured not just in coin, but in the straight furrows of newly plowed fields and the busy clamor of a town market. While controlling the royal treasury granted influence over existing wealth, some shadow sovereigns became architects of prosperity itself, actively shaping the economic landscape through innovation and hands-on management of their vast personal estates. This was power built from the ground up, a legacy written in fertile soil and thriving trade routes. Economic historians remind us that in pre-modern economies, land was the primary source of wealth and stability. A queen who was a formidable landowner did not merely collect rents. She became a chief executive, an agricultural reformer, and a venture capitalist, using her resources to generate new wealth that bolstered both her independence and the realm's health. Her initiatives were multifaceted. She could introduce new crops or more efficient farming techniques to her demesne lands, increasing yields and setting an example for surrounding areas. She sponsored fledgling industries such as wool weaving or mining by providing capital and protection. Founding new markets and annual fairs on her lands stimulated local economies, drawing merchants, creating jobs, and generating valuable tax revenue. She invested in vital infrastructure, commissioning the construction of roads and bridges that connected communities and facilitated trade, projects that served the public good while also enhancing the value of her own properties. Furthermore, she often acted as a final arbiter in commercial disputes among the merchants who operated under her charter, ensuring fair practice and fostering a stable business environment that encouraged further investment. This direct economic activity created a powerful personal bond of loyalty. The tenants who farmed her improved lands, the craftsmen employed in her workshops, and the traders who relied on her protected markets owed their livelihoods directly to her stewardship. Their prosperity was intertwined with hers, creating a base of support that was both economic and deeply personal, a loyalty more durable than that inspired by distant royal decrees. No queen exemplified this brand of economic prowess more clearly than Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England. While Edward earned his nickname as the Hammer of the Scots for his military campaigns, Eleanor was quietly hammering out a financial empire. Her dower lands, the properties granted to her as queen, were not passive income streams. She managed them with a sharp, aggressive business acumen, acquiring new manors, clearing forests for farmland, and developing town properties. She ran a sophisticated, almost modern financial operation, with a centralized accounting system that tracked revenues and expenses across her widespread holdings. Her agents were constantly on the move, auditing accounts, negotiating leases, and seeking new profitable ventures. This relentless management made Eleanor one of the wealthiest individuals in the realm, independent of the royal exchequer. Her economic power provided a stable foundation for her political influence, funding her own household and patronage without needing to petition the king's treasury, and allowing her to act as a crucial financial backer for Edward's ambitions when needed. Eleanor and others like her understood that true authority required a foundation of tangible, growing wealth. They were not just spenders of the realm's treasure, but its cultivators, turning land and opportunity into a resilient form of power that nourished both their influence and the people who depended on their vision. This economic bedrock gave them a stability that mere political maneuvering could not, but it also placed them at the heart of a vast and vulnerable network of assets and obligations. The splendor of a queen's court could be a more persuasive ambassador than any army. While kings projected strength through treaties and troops, a shadow sovereign often wielded a subtler, more captivating form of power, one built on beauty, intellect, and prestige. This was the art of the cultural diplomat, where soft power became a strategic asset, attracting allies and commanding respect not through fear but through admiration. By transforming her court into the most brilliant center of art, music, and learning in the known world, a queen could elevate her kingdom's status on the international stage, making it the place every ruler wanted to be associated with. Foreign ambassadors did not just report on political negotiations, they sent home breathless letters describing the court's magnificence, the sophistication of its conversations, and the genius of its artists. As one envoy wrote of a particularly dazzling royal court, its glory does not merely reflect the king's wealth, but the queen's unparalleled taste and governance. This cultural capital was a currency that purchased immense political leverage. A kingdom seen as the pinnacle of civilization was a desirable ally, its influence extending through the shared language of art and philosophy. Queens orchestrated this reputation with meticulous care. They hosted international festivals and lavish tournaments that were less about martial competition and more about spectacular display, drawing nobility from across Europe to witness their realm's prosperity and cultural vitality. These events were diplomatic theaters where alliances were forged during a masquerade ball or a joust, and where the hosting queen stood as the gracious center of a web of new connections. Furthermore, they acted as the chief patrons of humanist scholars, philosophers, and scientists, drawing the greatest minds of the age to their courts. This patronage did more than produce beautiful works. It signaled that their kingdom was a beacon of progress and enlightened thought, a place where new ideas could flourish under royal protection. This attracted not just artists but foreign princes who wished to be educated in such an environment, creating bonds of loyalty that lasted a lifetime. While many queens mastered this, one figure who perfectly epitomized the concept, even without a royal title, was Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua. In the fiercely competitive world of Renaissance Italy, where city-states jostled for power, Isabella used culture as her primary political instrument. She cultivated one of the most legendary courts in Europe, a salon filled with the finest painters like Titian, musicians, poets, and philosophers. Her studiolo, a private study adorned with allegorical paintings, was a masterpiece of intellectual self-fashioning. This cultural authority gave her an outsized diplomatic voice. When her husband was captured in war, Isabella negotiated his release directly with the Pope and the King of France, not merely as a pleading wife, but as a respected peer whose cultural prestige demanded attention. She corresponded with emperors and popes as an equal in matters of art and statecraft, using her reputation as the First Lady of the Renaissance to secure political favors and protect her small state from being swallowed by larger powers. For Isabella, and for the shadow sovereigns who followed her model, a passion for culture was never just a personal indulgence. It was a calculated, brilliant strategy to build a kingdom's brand, to make it indispensable, and to wield influence from a position of unquestioned sophistication. This soft power could open doors that military might could only batter down, proving that sometimes the most effective throne was a chair placed at the center of the world's most fascinating conversation. The king's final breath was not just a personal loss, it was a political earthquake. For the queen, whose influence was woven into his very being, the throne's sudden vacancy meant her entire world of carefully constructed power could collapse in an instant. This was the ultimate test for the shadow sovereign, the moment she transformed from a wielder of influence into a survivor navigating the perilous landscape of downfall, exile, or forced retirement. When the protection of the crown vanished, her enemies emerged from the shadows, and every past decision was scrutinized for evidence of treason or witchcraft. Studies on political disgrace in pre-modern courts reveal a chilling pattern. The fall of a favorite was often swift and brutal, but for a queen, the stakes were astronomically higher, involving not just her freedom but the fate of her children and her entire legacy. The strategies for survival became as complex as those for rule. Some negotiated private settlements, trading public claims to power for a secure pension and a quiet life on a remote estate, a bittersweet retirement that preserved life but ended influence. Others, facing more dire threats, relied on the international networks they had built over a lifetime, calling in favors from foreign rulers to secure sanctuary in a distant court, living out their days as respected but powerless guests. A powerful final tool was the pen. In exile, many turned to writing detailed memoirs or spiritual meditations, not as idle reminiscence, but as a calculated defense of their legacy, an attempt to speak to history directly and shape the narrative that would outlive their detractors. Throughout this ordeal, any remaining loyal faction became a lifeline. These steadfast supporters could provide hidden funds, smuggle messages, or offer physical protection when official channels had turned hostile. And always, a demonstrated record of profound religious piety became a vital shield, framing the fallen queen not as a schemer but as a pious woman enduring a trial of faith, making overt violence against her seem an affront to heaven itself. The career of Anne of Brittany, Queen of France, stands as a masterclass in this desperate resilience. Upon the sudden death of her husband, King Charles VIII, Anne found herself in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. She was the hereditary Duchess of Brittany, a wealthy duchy France had long coveted, and she was now a childless widow in a foreign court. Her power and her homeland's independence hung by a thread. With breathtaking political agility, Anne navigated the succession crisis. She leveraged the terms of her marriage contract and the immediate control of her duchy to force the new king, Louis XII, into negotiations. The result was a staggering display of survival. She secured an agreement that nullified Louis's existing marriage so he could marry her, thus making her Queen of France once again and safeguarding Brittany's autonomy for her lifetime. In the span of a few months, Anne turned potential disaster into a reaffirmation of her authority, proving that the skills of the shadow sovereign, negotiation, foresight, and sheer nerve, were just as critical in managing downfall as in orchestrating rise. The ends of these hidden reigns often reveal as much about their skill as their peaks of power. In the quiet of a convent or the guarded halls of exile, the final act was not about command, but about preservation, a last defiant effort to ensure that their story and the mark they left upon the world would not be erased by the turbulent currents of history. Centuries after her final decree, a queen's true power is often buried beneath a simpler story. The historical record rarely preserved the nuanced reality of the shadow sovereign, instead offering a stark choice between two familiar archetypes. She was either the wicked manipulator, a scheming temptress who led kings astray, or the saintly matron, a paragon of passive virtue who existed only to support her husband. Both caricatures served the same purpose: to obscure the complex, active political authority she actually wielded, making her fit into a narrative that made sense to the chroniclers who wrote her story. These chroniclers, overwhelmingly male clerics or court historians dependent on royal favor, possessed a worldview with no clear category for a woman who governed. When faced with evidence of a queen's decisive statecraft, they often interpreted it through the only lenses they had: morality and domesticity. Her shrewd diplomacy became feminine wiles. Her economic management was labeled greed. Her necessary firmness in a crisis was recast as unnatural harshness. The process of myth-making was not accidental. It was a coping mechanism for a society uncomfortable with the reality of female command. As scholars in the field of memory studies point out, each generation rewrites the past to suit its own values and anxieties. A queen who challenged the status quo in her lifetime became a convenient cautionary tale for later eras seeking to reinforce traditional gender roles. Conversely, a queen who could be sanitized and stripped of her political teeth was elevated as an ideal, her complexity sanded away to create a harmless icon. The rediscovery of their true voices has been a slow, meticulous task for modern historians. It often begins in a forgotten archive with the unearthing of a private letter in her own hand, a detailed household account book she authorized, or a diplomatic instruction she drafted. These documents, free from the interpretive filter of contemporary chroniclers, reveal the sharp intellect, the logistical concerns, and the political calculations that were her daily reality. They rewrite the story from the inside out, replacing legend with the messy, brilliant details of governance. This revised understanding now colors their portrayal in modern media, where filmmakers and novelists increasingly depict these figures not as villains or saints, but as the strategic politicians they were, navigating the same brutal constraints as their male counterparts. The evolving legacy of Marie Antoinette stands as the perfect example of this contested memory. For 2 centuries after the French Revolution, she was frozen in the popular imagination as the ultimate symbol of reckless extravagance and callous privilege, the queen who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." This caricature served a powerful political purpose, simplifying the complex causes of the revolution into a morality tale about a decadent court. Yet decades of historical scholarship have chipped away at this myth. By examining her extensive correspondence and court records, historians have revealed a more nuanced figure, a young woman thrust into a hostile political environment who became an active, though often clumsy, player in factional politics, a devoted mother, and a patron of the arts who sought to modernize the monarchy's image. Her story is no longer just about a spendthrift, but about a political actor trapped in an impossible situation, her failures and strategies laid bare. This shift is not about rehabilitation for its own sake, but about accuracy. To understand the true mechanics of power in any era, we must look past the simplifying myths and listen for the quiet, determined voice in the margins of the official record, the one that was always there, guiding, deciding, and ruling from the shadows all along. Across a vast continent, in a palace of vermilion walls and golden roofs, another queen held the strings of power. The phenomenon of the shadow sovereign was not a European invention, but a human constant, a recurring pattern of political ingenuity that appeared wherever a throne cast its long shadow. To understand its true nature, we must widen our gaze from the Gothic halls of England and France to the intricate courts of Byzantium, the forbidden city of China, and the opulent seraglios of the Ottoman Empire. While the costumes, titles, and legal justifications changed dramatically, the core reality remained: women of formidable will navigating patriarchal systems to command empires from behind a ceremonial male figurehead. The mechanisms, however, were shaped by profoundly different cultural clay. In the East, the legal and social frameworks for female authority often followed distinct blueprints. Consider the concept of regency. In many European monarchies, a queen mother's regency for a child king was a recognized, if contested, legal office. In imperial China, the framework was even more formalized under the Confucian system. When a young emperor ascended the dragon throne, state doctrine permitted his mother, the Empress Dowager, to serve as regent, often from behind a silk screen during audiences to preserve the ritual separation of genders. This gave figures like Empress Dowager Cixi a powerful, culturally sanctioned platform. From the 1860s until her passing in 1908, Cixi effectively ruled the Qing dynasty, first through her son and then through her nephew, navigating the empire's catastrophic wars and internal rebellions with an iron will. Her authority, while still facing fierce opposition from conservative ministers, operated within an accepted, if precarious, space in the political architecture. The physical and social space of influence also differed radically. In the Ottoman Empire, the traditional seat of a queen's power was not the council chamber, but the harem, known as the imperial harem. Far from being merely a secluded residence, the harem evolved into a sophisticated political institution, a parallel court with its own economy, hierarchy, and channels of communication. Here, the mother of the reigning sultan, the Valide Sultan, held supreme domestic authority and immense political sway. Her influence peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries during the so-called Sultanate of Women. A pivotal figure was Hurrem Sultan, also known as Roxolana, the beloved wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. She broke centuries of convention by marrying the Sultan publicly, moving out of the harem's old quarters, and engaging directly in state affairs through correspondence with foreign rulers and interventions in political appointments. Her power reshaped the dynamics of the Ottoman court, proving that even within the most rigidly structured systems, a determined individual could redraw the lines of access and authority. Global historians such as Dr. Amanda Foreman note that comparing these models reveals a crucial insight. Whether the setting was a European palace, a Chinese courtyard, or an Ottoman seraglio, the fundamental challenges were strikingly similar. These women all had to master the art of building loyal factions, managing economic resources, controlling information, and performing a public role that legitimized their behind-the-scenes control. They all walked the same tightrope between necessary action and perceived overreach. The tools varied. A European queen might use religious patronage, while an Ottoman Valide sultan might use her control over harem appointments and her access to the sultan's private hours, but the end goal of stable, effective governance was the same. This comparative view dissolves the illusion that the shadow sovereign was a historical oddity. Instead, it reveals her as a global archetype. From the Byzantine Empress Theodora advising Justinian to the Trung sisters leading Vietnamese resistance against Chinese rule, the drive and capacity for female leadership in the absence of overt title was a persistent force across civilizations. It was a universal drama of ambition, intellect, and survival, played out on the world stage with different scripts but the same compelling plot: the relentless pursuit of authority in a world that insisted on granting the crown to someone else. Recognizing this shared story forces a profound question. If their influence was so widespread and their strategies so effective, why does history so often insist on forgetting their names or remembering them only through the distorting lens of legend and scandal? The ink on a private letter often reveals more than the gilded words of a state proclamation. To truly understand the shadow sovereign, we must move beyond the mechanics of her power and into the quiet chambers of her mind, to the complex tangle of ambition, duty, and identity that compelled her to walk such a perilous path. What inner forces drove a woman to seek command in a world that denied her the crown? Her motivations were rarely singular, but a layered tapestry of personal and political threads. Foremost was often a fierce, protective sense of dynastic duty, a drive to secure the throne not just for her husband, but for her children. In an era where a child king's reign could end in a palace coup, a queen's political maneuvering was, in her eyes, the deepest form of maternal devotion. She became the mother of the country to ensure she remained the mother of the king. Yet intertwined with this duty was undeniable personal ambition, the intellectual and visceral satisfaction of governance. For women of formidable intellect denied formal education in statecraft, the court presented a labyrinthine puzzle of human nature and policy, a game of immense consequence. Mastering it provided a profound sense of agency and purpose that the confined domestic sphere could never offer. As historian Joanna Lanesmith notes, many of these women framed their ambition not as a selfish grab, but as a sacred stewardship, a calling to use their unique position for the stability and moral good of the realm. Their personal letters, those rare unfiltered windows, crackle with this tension. We read expressions of acute fear for a son's safety, deep frustration with obstructive counselors, and weary determinations to persevere against all odds. Consider the writings of Margaret of Navarre, sister to a king of France and a queen in her own right, a pivotal figure in the turbulent early Reformation. Her extensive correspondence and literary works reveal a mind passionately engaged with religious reform and political philosophy. She saw her influence not as a means to personal glory, but as a tool to protect evangelical thinkers, to foster a more compassionate governance, and to navigate the deadly factions at court. Her motivation was a fusion of deep personal faith, intellectual passion, and a protective duty to her brother's kingdom. This psychological burden was immense. Theirs was a life of constant, exhausting vigilance, where a misplaced trust or an unguarded comment could spell disaster. It strained marriages, turning partnership into a delicate dance of persuasion and performance. It demanded the burden of secrecy, carrying the weight of state decisions without the freedom to claim credit or share the strain. The role offered immense satisfaction to a capable mind, the thrill of solving a diplomatic crisis or seeing a just law enacted, but it was a satisfaction forever tempered by isolation and risk. To understand this inner world is to see these figures not as chess pieces on a historical board, but as full human beings navigating an impossible set of expectations with courage, calculation, and often profound loneliness. Their legacy is not just in the policies they shaped, but in the sheer will it took to shape them from the shadows, a testament to the human spirit's relentless drive to matter, to protect, and to govern. A palace's grand throne room was the stage for power, but its true engine often hummed quietly in the private chambers beyond. To understand a shadow sovereign's reign, we must walk the corridors she walked, tracing the geography of her influence through the very stones and gardens of her home. Architectural historians remind us that space is never neutral. It is designed to enable certain actions and forbid others. The layout of a royal residence was a meticulously coded map of access and authority, and the Queen's apartments were its most carefully guarded sector. These were not merely luxurious bedrooms, they were the operational headquarters of hidden rule, each room serving a distinct political function in the delicate machinery of her command. First, consider the solar, or the Queen's private sitting room. This was the true nerve center, located strategically within the inner court, often with a separate entrance from the king's apartments. The solar provided a sanctuary for confidential business. Its very name, derived from the Latin for sun, hints at its purpose, a bright, intimate space for private counsel, away from the dark, crowded public halls. Here, the Queen held her shadow council meetings. The room's furnishings, plush tapestries and cushioned benches, were designed not just for comfort, but for acoustics, to soften voices and prevent eavesdropping. From this chamber, she reviewed state papers, drafted confidential letters, and received trusted advisors without the formal protocols that slowed the king's official counsel. The solar was where policy was formulated before it was ever presented as the king's will. Adjacent to these living quarters, her private chapel served a dual purpose. On the surface, it was a place for personal devotion, a demonstration of her piety, but beneath that sacred veneer, it functioned as a premier networking venue. After Mass, the Queen could linger, engaging in discreet conversation with a bishop about a church appointment, or with an ambassador about a pending treaty, all under the unimpeachable cover of shared prayer. The chapel was a space where political alliances could be blessed before they were ever inked on parchment. Similarly, the palace gardens, those manicured landscapes of herbs and flowers, were not just for leisure. A walk along a secluded garden path with a key noble or a foreign envoy was a classic setting for the most sensitive negotiations. The open air provided privacy, the rustling leaves masking conversations, and the act of walking side by side fostered a sense of conspiratorial partnership. These cultivated spaces were extensions of her diplomatic salon. Crucially, within this private suite were two highly secure rooms that anchored her tangible power. The first was her personal treasury, a strong room separate from the crown's official exchequer. This was where she safeguarded the wealth from her dower lands, the jewels from her dowry, and the resources used for her patronage network. Controlling this physical cache of valuables gave her the immediate means to reward loyalty or finance initiatives without bureaucratic delay. The second was the secretariat, the office of her private clerks. This was the administrative heart where her correspondence was copied, ciphered, and sealed, where records of her estates were kept, and where the intelligence gathered by her network was compiled. The flow of information into and out of the Queen's world was managed here by scribes whose loyalty was to her alone. The apartments of Anne of Brittany at the Château de Blois offer a perfect architectural manifesto of this hidden sovereignty. As both the hereditary Duchess of Brittany and Queen of France, Anne needed a space that physically articulated her dual, powerful identity. Her suite was a self-contained universe within the palace. Its famous spiral staircase, adorned with sculpted ermines, her personal emblem, and fleurs de lis, the symbol of France, announced her fused authority to anyone who ascended. Her study or cabinet was a small, intensely private room lined with cabinets for papers and precious objects, a place for the most concentrated work. The layout allowed her to move between her ceremonial receiving rooms and these private work spaces seamlessly, controlling who saw her in which context. Every carved symbol, the positioning of doors, and the sequence of rooms was a deliberate statement, proclaiming that this was the domain of a ruler in all but title. These walls did not just house a queen, they facilitated a reign, their very architecture whispering the sophisticated, perilous, and utterly essential art of ruling from the rooms behind the throne. The strategies of the shadow sovereign never truly vanished from the world. They simply exchanged their royal costumes for modern dress. The legacy of these queens is not locked in palace archives, but lives on in the invisible architecture of power that shapes our world today, from the hushed corridors of government to the glass towers of global finance. While the thrones have largely been replaced by elected offices and corporate boards, the fundamental dynamic of influence exercised from behind a ceremonial leader remains a constant of human organization. The queen who mastered patronage now has a parallel in the political advisor who builds a loyal faction within a party. The regent who governed for a child king finds her echo in the deputy prime minister or chief operating officer who steers the ship while the public face attends to ceremony. Their playbook, written in the ink of necessity centuries ago, is still being used. Political scientists often study what they call informal governance networks, the unseen webs of relationships and influence that operate alongside, and sometimes in place of, formal bureaucratic structures. These are the modern shadow councils, the kitchen cabinets and inner circles where real policy is debated long before it reaches an official vote. A contemporary chief of staff, wielding control over a president's schedule, access, and information flow, exercises a form of authority that would feel deeply familiar to a medieval queen consort. In corporate boardrooms, a visionary founder may hold the title of chief executive officer, while the true operational genius, perhaps a long-trusted colleague or strategist, manages the intricate details that allow the vision to become reality. Their influence is immense, yet their name may never appear in a headline. Even in international diplomacy, the most crucial breakthroughs are often brokered not by heads of state at a summit photo op, but by their most trusted envoys in closed-door meetings, building the framework for agreement through patient, behind-the-scenes negotiation. The challenges they face are also hauntingly familiar. How does one gain recognition for indispensable work without appearing to undermine the official leader? How is influence maintained when it lacks the clear mandate of a title? The modern power behind the throne must still navigate the treacherous waters of perception, ensuring their guidance is seen as loyal support rather than a covert takeover. They must build networks, control information, and manage their own public image with the same care as a queen managing her reputation through portraiture and public charity. Their stories teach us a timeless lesson about the nature of authority. True power is multifaceted. The ceremonial role, the official title, is just one facet, often the most visible one. But the substantive power to shape decisions, to mobilize resources, and to steer the course of events often resides elsewhere, in the hands of those who have mastered the arts of access, trust, and execution. The next time you observe a major political announcement or a corporate shift in strategy, pause for a moment. Look past the person at the podium. Consider the advisors in the background, the deputies who prepared the briefing books, the allies who secured the necessary support. In their careful movements and quiet counsel, you are witnessing the enduring legacy of the shadow sovereign, a testament to the idea that the most compelling history is often written not from the throne itself, but from the decisive space just beside it. Their stories are not footnotes, but foundational chapters in the grand narrative of power. From the strategic patronage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, weaving a continental empire through her children's marriages, to the diplomatic genius of Catherine de Medici, holding a fractured France together with letters and spies, to the regal resilience of Blanche of Castile, crushing rebellions to secure her son's throne, we have walked the hidden corridors of command. These women and countless others across continents and centuries exercised absolute authority not from a ceremonial throne, but from the space beside it, a space they forged through intelligence, necessity, and unwavering will. Their collective legacy dismantles a simplistic view of history as a chronicle of kings alone. In its place, we find a richer, more complex tapestry, one threaded with the subtle yet unbreakable silk of female political brilliance. This was power expressed through the quiet council that became law, through the crisis managed in a king's absence, through the Patronage Network that bought loyalty more reliably than any decree. They were not anomalies or accidents. They were essential architects of their eras, the steady hands on the tiller during storms of war, succession, and religious upheaval. Their reigns teach us a profound lesson about the nature of authority itself. True command is not always, or even often, about the seat you occupy. It is about the influence you cultivate, the trust you earn, the information you control, and the legacy you consciously build in stone, in law, and in the mind of the next ruler. These hidden sovereigns mastered this art, ruling empires while a king sat as the symbol of state. Their histories invite us to sharpen our gaze, to look beyond the obvious symbols of power in any age, in any boardroom or capital, and ask where the quiet, decisive currents of influence truly flow. Which of their multifaceted strategies resonates most with you? Was it the economic mastery of a landowner queen, the diplomatic web of a royal correspondent, or the resilient regency of a mother protecting her son's future? Share your reflections below, and if uncovering these lost layers of history captivates you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the mysteries woven through time. The past is not a simple story, it is a conversation, and the voices of these queens, long spoken from the shadows, are waiting to be heard.